Hello, this is Red Ream, and today I'm going to be going over my patch wish list for February. Um, it's going to be a bit of a special one because notably there was no patch last month, much to the dismay of pretty much everyone, other than the vacationers, I would assume. Uh, but there was the start of the competitive season, so the layout this month did still feel significantly different from the last, and I do think that enough of my opinions have changed that I could at least just go through and run over the opinions that I had that shifted. Additionally, there was technically a new card in Madoc that did have some amount of impact, so could be worth discussing that as well. Um, so, with those things being said, I guess we'll get through it and try to keep this nice and swift. So the first thing I wanted to go over was Nilfgaard. Nilfgaard at the end of last month was kind of just looking like the dominant faction, um, until the very, very end, where Witchers sort of started to come up in order to quote unquote counter the Nilfgaard, um, which in turn sort of opened in more other decks, which then sort of brought the Nilfgaards back in. So it's not really as clear cut as I made it sound in terms of Nilfgaard beating up Vise and having the power to really kind of just outrun other decks and not being nearly as targetable as Vi. With that being said, the longer this season has gone, the more people have realized that Nilfgaard can actually beat Witchers, which is really funny. Um, a lot of people were just kind of misplaying round one. A lot of people love Degreed Erlands, with especially things like Invo Erland, when in reality, the decks had such different game plans. One deck really wanted a long round, and one deck really wanted to push. That round one was just really important, and it's absolutely worth it to just jam Ramones and Brothens and throw locks and engines at your opponent. And Nilfgaard is kind of like a control engine hybrid, whereas Witchers is fairly point slammy, but they also have some good lock targets. And that actually just matches pretty well for Nilfgaard round one. It's usually just a round one game, but actually found it slightly easier to win the round one with Nilfgaard. And even if Nilfgaard loses round one, they still have some amount of game against the bleed. Whereas if Witchers loses round one, they're just completely toast. So from that sense, I still think that Nilfgaard is very, very strong. The other deck that besides Witchers that I didn't really account for last month, that can do well against Nilfgaard would be Elves. Elves are definitely an interesting matchup. It's not really obvious to me how good this is for Nilfgaard. Um, it really depends on. I think that's much more of a card choice matchup. I've found that the movement engines tend to make the matchup Nilfgaard favored, because Nilfgaard gains extremely good targets for their control tools that otherwise don't really do anything. It makes it a lot easier for them to play their hands, and also gives them much better informant targets. Whereas the pure elf version that I was playing with COC, I think is elf favored. But with all of this being said, Nilfgaard is still really, really strong. Their long round is just flat out unbeatable right now. Um, if you're just going pure 10v10, um, like even with the elves, usually the elves win by gaining some sort of an advantage in pushing. Um, or sometimes with last say they can contest the long round, but it's a lot more dangerous. But yeah, with that being said, I think that Nilfgaard is still extremely strong. And I think that additionally, Way of the Witcher still introduced a lot of problematic cards for Nilfgaard, which I went over in the last episode. Pretty much everything with the word deck on it that was printed last month has been hell to play against, especially in a competitive season. I will say that the new Nova Colgrim deck I think is actually not very good. I think actually all in Colgrim was probably stronger. Once people learned how to play against Nova Colgrim, like all in Colgrim, at least when it worked, it worked. And sure, if your opponent drew all the answers, you were fucked. But you ran the maximum number of skill checks and clogged them a bunch. It had a very clear game plan. Nova, if you just like punt round 1 against it, they don't get a good timing to play their Nova. And like the Colgrim is very easy to answer, even with a defender. And it's like there's not as much clog either. It really feels like it's easier to play around the clog. So I don't really respect that deck. However, I do think a lot of the cards in the deck are still complete bullshit. So none of those cards I am redacting my changes on. The only change I am redacting for Nilfgaard, partially, is Coup de Grace. Coup de Grace I gave a very harsh nerf to. 9 provisions all the way to 11. I decided that while, yes, Coup de Grace is ridiculously high power, and it's also not really efficient to play Menno in the Nilfgaard deck, which makes it more high rolly. Like, getting Coup in round 1 can just win you so many games, and missing Coup in round 1 can just miss you so much free power. However, you do have Roderick, and I do think that I do think that the card is really interesting, and the like Joachim package is cool and it's fun to use. And Echo cards in general, I think, are designed to be sort of support tools for the factions, and it's okay if they're a little bit crept. So I decided that Coup could probably be 10. Given that Nilfgaard is not as crazy dominant as it was when I made the last video, I decided Nilfgaard decks could have 1 more provision, is essentially what that means. It's kind of funny. Coup's pretty good. But yeah, I didn't want to punish people as much for playing specifically Coup. I think Coup is a card that I like people running in Nilfgaard. It's kind of more just that it's really ridiculously hard to justify not playing Coup right now. It is a big downside of non-ball Nilfgaard decks. So Nilfgaard, obviously there will be a link to the drive if you want to see all of the other changes that I made. But that essentially covers that. Monsters, I made absolutely no changes to. Chimera has actually been seeing like a very tiny amount of play at like 1 point during the thing. It seemed like it wasn't really doing anything at all. It seemed like it was just people trying out Swarm, maybe just being very frustrated with Vi, or being frustrated with Kelly even. It's possible, like, I mean, I don't know. My change is not going to break Chimera. I just know it. I don't know if I just completely said it could boost all tokens, period, if Chimera would then be broken. That to me is a little harder. That might be enough to break Chimera. But yeah, no change there. The Vi change is probably the only one really worth discussing. In my last video, I sort of expressed that I was just really, really frustrated with Vi as a card, period. And it was like so crazy ridiculous, and it was so meta polarizing that I just sort of never wanted to see it again. After playing with the card more, and after seeing Nilfgaard not be quite as dominant, and seeing other decks be able to find ways to beat Vi that are not reasonable, like running Spores is not reasonable, but like some decks have semi-reasonable ways to do it. And like there are more strategies for trying to tackle Vi than I anticipated. I would be sort of okay with it being a weak deck in a meta. I don't think that it has to be a purely garbage card. It's just way too strong right now. And I think that my biggest issue with it is just how polarizing it is in terms of number of tall removals can just determine games. Number of engines can also determine games. But I think that's just something that you're never going to get over with Vi. So I kept my strength in nerf. I think that Vi does not need to strengthen by 3 every time you consume it. I think that's kind of ridiculous. You're already getting another gold card in place of a tutor that is like super powerful. And you are getting a strengthen on that every single time. I don't get why that number has to be 3. So yeah, strengthen from 3 to 2, provision cost from 12 to 10. I gained some amount of confidence on that change. I think that would be enough of a nerf to Vi now. Whereas before I was like, holy shit, this card is broken as fuck. And I really don't want a meta where we just go from having Vi be tier 1 and everyone is playing Spores to having Vi be tier 1 and not as many people are playing Spores. Like, that was like the nightmare scenario for me. But I'm pretty confident that that wouldn't happen. I think the nerf is pretty substantial. Yeah, that covers monsters. SK, completely unchanged. Think if anything, Lippy got weaker. Lippy was the deck that more people expressed frustration with compared to stuff like Warriors. SK, in my opinion, is the 5th faction. I feel like that sort of evidenced itself more this season. Before, a lot of people were arguing for SK because statistically it was doing very well, even though to me, it seemed like it matched poorly into Monsters and Nilfgaard, which seemed like two very important factions to be good against, while not being notably good enough against NR or ST to really justify itself. And I feel like this season that kind of rung true. A lot of the top pro ladder players just flat out dropped the faction by the end. So I'm glad to see that sometimes I'm not talking out of my ass. Yeah, but no more tooting my own horn, I guess. ST, I made one change here, and I also added one notable untargeted card. Doblathana Sentry, last time around I gave it a nerf from 5 provisions to 6, and my justification for that was that it can scale in a manner that other 5 provision engines could not, which is true. However, part of the way in which it can scale in a way that other engines cannot is by not scaling at all. The movement package is extremely crazy against solitaire decks like Vi, but I think that is okay. If you're playing a solitaire deck like Vi, I think you're kind of signing up for that sort of shit to some extent. And I think notably, the movement package is extremely disruptible. We've seen quite a bit more control this month around. I think probably just from more pro players playing, and running control tools in decks that formerly didn't. Even Vi sometimes runs Thunder now. To the point, like, it kind of just makes it so that Sentry has a super high ceiling, and like cards with a super high ceiling being 5p to me was a little bit weird, but it's so difficult to hit that ceiling that I'm pretty okay with it being 5p, and I'm very confident that at 6p the card would just be dead. Like a lot of the ST, like some of the ST decks even started cutting movement. Really only Elves. Pretty much all the other ones still run movement just for lack of other cards. And them being good engines, and a lot of the other ST decks being engine-oriented. I mean, obviously, Matic doesn't run it, but that's just not a shock to anyone. So, yeah, reverting that nerf, I still think P-Strike could be 1 provision weaker. It very much promotes the unitless playstyle, and is also just a very strong leader still. It wasn't at the forefront of this metagame, but I would attribute that to Lockdown. Which I am pretty much just giving the axe to. I'm completely reworking it, as was established last month. So because of that, I think Precision Strike would regain its popularity. Having 2 completely dead Sentinels and losing 4 points on your leader is really nasty. So I think that the 1 point nerf would still be justified. I think Precision Strike in a vacuum is too many points for its flexibility on removal, and even thinning and token generation and things like that. But it's obviously not crazy. Gezras change I still like. Gezras change. Gezras is very, very popular. It's very, very answerable. I think it could be very slightly more answerable, and it would probably be healthier. You could argue it's almost a buff, because a lot of people are forced to Heatwave Gezras or Invo Gezras. Honestly, I am fine with that. The power level of Gezras right now is completely fair. After the meta has ironed out, it's definitely a very strong card, but it rewards you for going very wide, and it can be awkward at times. So I wouldn't mind it being a buff against people that are tall removing Gezras, but just making the card more accessible to be killed, assuming that you have the foresight to save an answer for it, and don't give it a timing where an opponent can play like a Gezras on a dry pass and get a ton of value out of it, or something like that. Volunteer nerf, I'm still convinced is the best way to nerf Justice. I don't really like the other options that much. Someone suggested that the order of the dwarves be switched. That's not a terrible suggestion. Basically, play the dwarf, then spawn the cleaver's muscle. It's kind of a cute idea. There's no real reason it couldn't be that way either. I do, however, Joe, think that Volunteer's condition is like easy enough that it being a 3-for-4 wouldn't really be super unjustified anyway. Kind of just brings it down to like the Dunbanner level. And justicing in like my counter argument there would be that justicing into Volunteers feels good. Like when I'm playing ST, it feels good to do that. Like I think it's a play that should be in the game. I don't think that Justice into Volunteers should be completely limited to Dwarf decks. I think that right now it's just kind of too powerful. Like, thinning feels good. Having an option for thinning feels good. I don't really see a like that. I guess that would be my argument. As to why I would want Volunteers nerfed over having the order switched. But I wouldn't really mind too much if the order was switched. My other notable untargeted card, because I've heard a lot of people talking about it since last month, is Saber-Tooth Tiger. I am completely fine with Saber-Tooth Tiger. That is my stance. I think a lot of people are just frustrated with artifacts in general, which is understandable, and Saber-Tooth Tiger being completely uninteractable as an effect. However, the effect is standalone weak enough, and play-aroundable enough, and 7-for-9 is bad enough stats, that I am honestly completely fine with it. I think that an effect like that being permanent doesn't like auto-secure a long round or anything crazy like that by any means. It does mean different things for different decks, and that makes the card a little bit matchup swingy. But with that being said, it is at worst a Heatwave target, and there is only one card that does its job. So there is sort of a cap on the card. The decks that would really struggle with this card, like Kelly, can Heatwave it. I don't really see a problem with it. The Matic deck has honestly proved to be a little bit weak in my opinion. Certainly not unviable levels of weak, but it feels like its best matchups are the other decks that sort of phased out, and some of its quote-unquote best matchups turned out to not be good matchups, like Nilfgaard. Nilfgaard can kind of just win a long round without last say, from my experience, if you save the ball late enough. The trick is to concentrate your points against that deck. In a lot of situations, especially if they burn the Tiger round 1. If they burn the Tiger round 1, you can just pass, and the game is pretty much just over. And if they don't burn the Tiger round 1, you have a lot of ways to contest them. So, to me, that matchup is not nearly as good as it would seem. So, with that being said, I don't really see a problem with the deck. I don't really feel like the deck is too powerful. I don't really feel like the card is too powerful. I feel like you even build around the card pretty substantially. There are a lot of cool ways to build around the card in that deck. And I don't know. Cool. Fine by me. Like, people were suggesting it be a unit, and I think as a unit, it would just be kind of too weak. Pretty much, period. You could give it armor, and I think it would still be too weak. You could give it stats, and then I think it would just become sort of like stats versus removal, and kind of, yeah. I think I prefer it in the form that it's in. NR. I made one change to NR, and that was because I pretty much only gave NR buffs, and it turns out NR is actually pretty good. Witchers are a perfectly healthy deck. I don't have a problem with Witchers being a deck. What I do have a problem with is the Witcher payoff cards completely just making all other NR decks irrelevant, not even a consideration. I saw one person try Shield Wall all of last season, and that was the only other NR deck that I saw for an entire month. And then Paz just promptly switched back to Witchers after I beat his ass with Witchers. So, yeah. With that being said, there is one card in the Witcher deck that is just way more stats, if you do the math on it, than I think could really be justified, even for a payoff card. And that is Vesemir. Vesemir is such a crazy flexible card. You can jam a lot of Witchers into that deck, to the point where Vesemir is baseline, like... I probably have a Witcher deck. I haven't really been clicking around. I probably should be clicking around more. Yeah, early in the morning for me. Got a bit of... yeah. So how many Witchers are actually in this deck? 1 Witcher, 2 Witcher, 3 Witcher, 4 Witcher. Oh, I counted Vesemir. Vesemir doesn't count. 1 Witcher, 2 Witcher, 3 Witcher, 4 Witcher, 5 Witcher, 6 Witcher, 7 Witcher. Kind of, I won't count it. 8 Witcher, 9 Witcher, 10, 11 Witcher, 12, 13 Witcher. So baseline, if you play the units in your deck and no tokens, you're getting a 17 for 10. This does not factor in Keldar, target practice, doesn't factor in mutation, doesn't factor in Scytheman, which obviously get a huge power spike from having all of the units boosted, though you could argue Erland is a little bit of redundancy in that role. That number is already nuts, but you have extreme flexibility on the distribution. You can play this card as a carryover card, you can play this card as a long round card, or anywhere in between, and it will still get its full value. And that is really, really strong. To me, this card, combined with the NR package, will just invalidate any other Point Slam deck currently in the meta, and so I do think that this card needs a nerf. I think it's fine for it to be extremely strong, but I think that strong is just not something that you can expect other decks to compete with. Obviously, there's a little bit of double counting in there. You are running some suboptimal Witchers, like the Griffin Witcher Mentor, but honestly, pretty much every other Witcher in this deck is pretty good. Yeah. So my change for Vesemir was power from 4 to 3 and adrenaline from 5 to 4. My reasoning for this was sort of twofold. The power change, I think, is fairly straightforward. There's no fundamental design flaw with Vesemir. It's completely okay for a card like this to exist. I think it's more just a numbers game. So I think that lowering the power of Vesemir would be good. And I don't think that it needs a crazy nerf. It's not like NR Witchers is a crazy deck. I think ideally, if I actually had control of the patch, I would throw in more buffs probably for some of the other NR cards. I don't really see why Vesemir needs to be nerfed into the ground. So that is the idea there. The adrenaline change is to make this card a little bit less flexible. The Adrenaline 4 forces you to actually sort of commit to the round in which you're playing Vesemir. With Adrenaline 5, if you are... Well, okay, that's not precisely true, actually. But Adrenaline 5 forces you to... Adrenaline 5 pretty much means that if you have Vesemir in round 1, you can play Vesemir, unless your opponent literally passes on 7. And the fact that your opponent can pass on 7 in some matchups is a nice feature of this card, but it feels like sort of not enough. I think that restricting when this card can be played a little bit and making it a little more awkward is kind of fine. And I think the other feature of this also sort of counteracts the fact that I lightened the load on the adrenaline for the actual Silver Witchers. Basically, Originally, I had said Silver Witchers shouldn't have Adrenaline, period. The cards are clunky to play, and a lot of people just play them intuitively because it feels good to jam Witchers on an empty board, and then realize that they can't. And that to me feels like bad game design. However, I decided after looking at A, the success of the NR Witcher deck, B, some amount of that just being people getting used to the change, because for the longest time these were just a jam the cards on the board type of card. And C, like the adrenaline flavor of Witchers. I decided it would probably make more sense to just reverse the adrenalines on these cards. To me, it almost makes more sense from a flavor perspective that you would play Eskel, Vesemir, and Lambert, and then play Vesemir, as opposed to the other way around. That's maybe up for debate, since this is sort of like a carryover card, and you can get the full boost by playing the Vesemir first and then playing these. But to me, it kind of seemed better. I guess let me know what you think. I'm not as sure about this change. Vesemir is kind of a hard one, because the question is pretty much how strong do you want the NR Witcher deck to be, and how unviable do you want other Witcher decks to be. NR Witchers support Vesemir by such a crazy amount more than every other faction's Witchers, to the point where it kind of feels like Vesemir could be an NR card. Not that I'm, like, mad that it's a neutral or anything like that. Like, I think it's cool that you can try Vesemir in other factions. It's not like a hideous card to be running in other factions. It's just inferior to running it in NR. So Syndicate, to me, I wanted to do more buffs for Syndicate this month because I think Syndicate still really didn't catch on. And it was kind of clear that the faction could use some buffs. However, I didn't really want to do too many because I think a lot of the cards that I would buff are older cards. And I feel like when it comes to what I would really want out of a patch change, I sort of would want to emphasize buffing the newer cards, because I think it would be cool for them to have a chance to see play. To me, the Syndicate card pool is the most polarizing of the bunch. You have cards that have seen play in Syndicate since the faction's incarnation, and then you have cards that just haven't been around as long as cards from the other factions. Like, cards from the other factions that were weak sort of very eventually got buffed, and some of them still just flat out never became usable, but some of them became usable at some point. And sort of let them get up to snuff. Whereas with Syndicate just hasn't had as much time, and it doesn't really feel like CDPR has given the Syndicate cards that are bad enough love. And from that perspective, it sort of feels like, to me, Syndicate is sort of weaker just because, to me, it feels like Syndicate will get weaker every single expansion, because the card pool of the other factions is stronger than the card pool of Syndicate. Syndicate is more reliant on having a few sort of crutch cards. Like, right now, they can barely build 2 decks. They can barely build the cash deck by jamming every single horde effect that makes sense, and they can barely build the congregate deck by jamming every single Firesworn card that makes sense. And even still, they have to run like a crime package too. And so from that perspective, to me, it kind of just feels like Syndicate needs more cards. Or maybe not literally more cards, but needs more buffs, sort of across the board. I could go through and try to do these at some point, but it sort of felt out of flavor for a patch list. It's kind of out of scope. I don't know. I think the ones that I mentioned were like the ones that were the biggest offenders. Rayla especially is just really offensive, and I liked my idea for reworking Rayla quite a bit. You could definitely be more aggressive than I am being. I think SY, after seeing this month played out, if these were all of the buffs that SY was getting, SY would still be pretty hopeless. So I am aware of the fact that SY needs more. But I think more kind of just comes across the board. I don't really think more is like, oh yeah, here's this obvious change that they should make. Like, how are they not seeing it, TM? I think there are a lot of ways that they could buff SY that would be viable. So that's my stance there. Neutrals, I sort of mentioned it earlier, but Eskel, Lambert, and Vesemir, rather than completely removing Adrenaline, I just push them to Adrenaline 5. I think that having a proactive play beyond Adrenaline 5 feels good. Honestly, the switch between Vesemir and the more, like, when I wrote the change, it made a lot of sense to me. Thinking about it now, I'm not sure that makes sense. Like, having less flexibility on when to play Vesemir, I think is good, but I think my argument of like, oh, it would make more sense to play the Witchers and then play Vesemir kind of falls flat, because Vesemir is a carryover card. To me, I still would like the Adrenaline on these cards to be a little bit more lenient. Like, giving up Witchers is such a committal play, and it really telegraphs that you're going sort of all in just because of the amount of power that you get when you play these cards most of the time. That it is like, to me, it's perfectly fine if people are allowed to play them earlier. I don't know. I don't really have a problem with it. I've never been in like a round 2 scenario and been like, oh shit, if my opponent could drop these Witchers this turn, I'd just be fucking screwed. And then my opponent plays like a 4-point Lambert and loses the game. That's never happened to me. So I still think it could be done. It's a little bit more difficult given that Witchers turn out to actually be strong. Yes, I admit it. Sigh. But yeah. So might be a bit of a miss there for me. This whole month has been kind of hard just because it's kind of like, what do I even say? It's the same goddamn patch at the end of the day. I still agree with my general neutral removal bump up. I think that these are tech cards, and I think that you should really be paying out the ass for them, and not just jamming them into every deck whether they need them, or could kind of just run them as filler, because why not? I would prefer that decks need them and otherwise turn to faction cards. So, yeah. Yurt and Enigni are even more disgusting this month than they already were. Fuck those cards. Maybe I should bold those just because it's that much more important of a change. It's still like my Oniromancy rework. I guess I added a notable untargeted card in Matic. After playing with Matic, I think it's fine. It pushes unitless, and that's never really a good thing. But there is sort of a flip side to that, which is that unitless decks now actually have a direction, and also rely on a unit that you can interact with at all. Like, you can lock Matic, you can banish Matic. The card is efficient enough that it pushes unitless sort of decks, but it is also it also in a way makes those decks a little bit less polarizing. It's not just like a fuck you if you have a bunch of removals as much. And it also like gives you more of a clear deck building direction too. Like, you want bombs. And I think that the bombs are kind of neat. They've literally never been played. Now they're sort of being played, and that's kind of fine. So Madak was a card that really scared me when I read the text, just because I was like, okay, this card probably won't be that good now. And then at some point they'll forget it exists, they'll print a decent bomb, they'll break the shit out of it. But after seeing the card in action, I'm pleasantly surprised. I like this card more than I thought I would. The randomness also sort of caps it. There are a lot of good ways to try to fight against Matic value. And there is some amount of play from the Matic player's side as well to prevent that. Yeah, cool card. Long-term health changes, I made one change here. I decided that long-term Ivar doesn't really need to be yeeted. It still could be. I'm not really a fan of the card. To me, it kind of just feels like a little bit of a hate card, and I don't really like those. But with that being said, I think that my change in the Nilfgaard section to a VAR is kind of sufficient for a card like a VAR. I think with Adrenaline 3, it's possible enough to play around, even for factions like Monsters. And also with the power being 5 and versus 4, it's not as devastating when it actually lands, and it's a little bit more forgiving when it doesn't land. I think my change was overall just good to the card, and I think that it is kind of fine if they make that change. There are far more disgusting Nilfgaard cards. I kind of learned to pick my battles a little bit. So yeah, those are my updates for this month. Hope you all enjoyed. Let me know what you think. And see ya.